Let's begin. Welcome to the PIDE webinar. This is the Pakistan Institute of Development Economics. My name is Nadeem Haque. As you know, we in Pakistan, in the Institute of Development Economics, are engaged in a quest to bring the best thought to Pakistan. Professor Sandel is here. We'll introduce him shortly. Professor Sandel, Pakistan Institute of Development Economics is a very old institute as far as Pakistan is concerned. It was set up in 1957 and it has been in place since 1957. It has had its ups and downs like everything in a developing world. We don't go linearly, we go in a very up and down fashion. It was in fact set up by the Harvard Advisory Group, and we had advisors from Harvard and Yale and Princeton working here for a while. And then lots of good things have happened in PIDE, but lots of bad things have also happened in PIDE. So here we are. Our objective, we've been trying to do this for the last 2 years to build this up. It is still the best think tank in Pakistan, but we are trying to make it as internationally competitive as possible. So we are arranging a large number of webinars plus a large number of, we're producing a lot of research on modern topics, interesting topics, which you love. For example, we held a very big conference on opportunities to excel now and the future, which I think I wish we could have got you for that, because there's exactly something we'd like to hear from you, because it's an important subject from where we sit, because we are a large country, 220 million people, and we are sitting on the crossroads of many battlefields. As you know, we are sitting on the edge of terrorism. I will not hesitate to say. We are sitting on the edge of fundamentalism, and to us, quite frankly, educating Pakistan is a challenge, and a very important challenge. That is when we reach out to people like yourself, and we really, really feel honored that you accept our invitation. We also conduct a very wide-ranging debate in Pakistan on many issues, and some of issues, something like what you talk about. So with that perspective, I would like to, ladies and gentlemen, tell you that today we have the special honor of getting Professor Michael Sandel, who the world knows as a superstar academic. I first came across Professor Sandel watching American television. And much to my surprise, sorry, my daughter actually introduced me to him. Much to my surprise, I found that the Harvard class was being held on television. And I was spellbound. I watched the whole series, Justice, the Justice series, Professor Sandel, which was riveting and fascinating. It competed with Star Trek in my mind. So that was fascinating. But since then, Professor Sandel has taken many, many interesting positions. But to introduce Professor Sandel, let me call the Pro-Vice Chancellor of PIDE, Duray Nayab. Please introduce Professor Sandel, then we'll go to Professor Sandel.
Thank you, Dr. Nadeem. It's our great privilege and honor to have Professor Sandel with us for this webinar. Since most of us know about him, I'll keep the introduction short. Professor Michael Sandel teaches political philosophy at Harvard and delivers lectures at many prestigious institutions. His course, Justice, is the first Harvard course to be made freely available online and has been viewed by tens of millions of people around the world. His books, including Justice, What's the Right Thing to Do, and What Money Can't Buy, have been translated into more than 30 languages. Professor Sandel's latest book, about which he's going to talk today, The Tyranny of Merit, What's Become of the Common Good, was named the best book of the year by The Guardian, Bloomberg, New Statesman, The Times Literary Supplement, and the New Weekly. The China Newsweek named him the most influential foreign figure of the year, while the New Statesman described him as the world's most influential living philosopher. Without further ado, I request Professor Sandel, whom the Newsweek referred to as the rock star moralist, to give another blockbuster lecture to us. Over to you, Professor Sandel.
Well,
so Professor Sandel, you can make your statement, then we'll have the conversation. Go ahead.
Very good, very good. What a warm introduction. Thank you to the Pro-Vice Chancellor And thank you to Dr. Haque for that very warm introduction and welcome. The Pakistan Institute of Development Economics has really a storied career, and Dr. Haque mentioned some of the early contributors to it, and one of them I discovered, one of them turns out to have been an old friend of mine, Gustav Reines, an economist from Yale, who was a part of this institute, I think from close to the beginning, if I'm not mistaken.
He was one of the first, he was one of the first directors of the institute.
Aha, yes, and he was a dear friend. So it's in his memory, it has special meaning for me to join you for this event and this conversation. And I should first say a word about my lack of qualifications for this presentation. I am not an economist. I teach political philosophy. And as the Pro-Vice Chancellor has mentioned, and Dr. Haque as well, I teach and write about justice. And one of my recent books is about the moral limits of markets. It's called What Money Can't Buy. So I've engaged with economists and with economic theories and offered some critiques of market thinking extended to realms of life beyond the realms of commodities and products. And the recent book is The Tyranny of Merit. I thought I would give just a brief overview of the themes of the book, and then to engage in some conversation about the themes with Dr. Haque, who's reflected deeply on these issues.
Nadeem, please, just call me Nadeem, Michael, if you can. Thank you. Go ahead.
Nadeem, yes, of course. So the tyranny of merit, that's a paradox. Because normally we think of merit as a good thing, something to aspire to, something to honor. If we're handing out jobs or social roles or important positions in the government, and if the alternative to merit is cronyism or corruption or nepotism or hereditary privilege, the principle of merit is a good thing and a liberating thing. So much so that we come to think of merit as a principle of distribution as defining the meaning of justice. It's certainly true that if I need surgery, I want a well-qualified surgeon to perform it. That's merit. That's being well qualified for a role. If I'm flying in an airplane, I want a well-qualified pilot at the controls. So how can merit become a kind of tyranny? Well, this takes us to the ideal of meritocracy. Now, meritocracy is a term that only came into familiar use in the late 1950s. The term was coined by a British sociologist named Michael Young. He was affiliated with the Labour Party. And he wrote at a time when the class system was finally beginning to break down, when people from the working classes were finally having an opportunity to get a good education and to compete for jobs with those who had come from wealthy families and gone to privileged schools. And this was a good thing. But Michael Young saw that there was a dark side to the principle of meritocracy. And in his short book, he imagined how it would play out. He imagined a future in which all barriers to achievement would be removed, and that would be a good thing. But it would lead to attitudes toward success that would be damaging to the common good. Because if we were able to realize a perfect meritocracy with perfectly fair equality of opportunity, that would be good. That would be an improvement over the current state of affairs. But there would be the risk, even the likelihood, he thought, that the winners, those who landed on top, would believe that their success was their own doing. After all, they had earned it in a fair competition. And by implication, that those who fell short, those who struggled, they must deserve their fate as well. These attitudes towards success, the hubris that meritocracy breeds among the winners, the demoralization that it produces among those left behind, these attitudes towards success are the dark side of meritocracy. And what we've seen is that as inequality globally, inequality has deepened in recent decades, meritocratic attitudes towards success have intensified their hold. Those who've landed on top have come to believe that their success is their own doing, the measure of their merit, and that they therefore deserve the full measure of the bounty that markets bestow upon them. And they've come to believe, by implication, that those who struggle in the global economy have no one to blame but themselves. This is the dark side of meritocracy. I call it meritocratic hubris among the winners, the tendency of the successful to inhale too deeply of their own success, to forget the luck and good fortune that helped them on their way, to forget their indebtedness to those who make their achievements possible. These harsh attitudes towards success, which are connected to the meritocratic ideal, I think have contributed to the loss of social cohesion and the difficulty of summoning solidarity in societies that increasingly are riven by inequalities. The problem is not the inequalities alone. That's an injustice. The problem is when that injustice is compounded by the insult to those who struggle, the insult that says, your failure is your fault. You deserve where you've landed, because insofar as society is a fair competition, you've run the race and lost, or perhaps you haven't trained to run the race at all. And I think this hardening of meritocratic attitudes towards success has coincided with the growing inequalities in many of our societies, certainly in my own, during the 4 decades of globalization, when the greatest rewards have flowed to those at the top, and when the bottom half of our populations have enjoyed almost none of the economic growth that globalization has produced. As a result, because of these harsh attitudes towards success, because of the hubris among the winners, the humiliation among those left behind, working people become increasingly resentful of elites. And we see this playing out politically. I think we saw it playing out politically in the vote in the UK in the vote for Brexit in 2016, when overwhelmingly those with advanced degrees voted to remain in the European Union, and those without a college education voted to leave. And then a few months later, we saw it in the United States with the election of Donald Trump, who overwhelmingly won the vote of men without a university degree. And in Western democracies, in the United States, in Britain, in France, in Germany, center-left parties in particular have suffered from the populist backlash. because one of the deepest divides in politics has become the divide between those with and those without a university degree. It used to be that parties of the center left drew upon constituencies of working people, and that they defended working people against the powerful and the privileged. But by the 1990s and 2000s, these parties became increasingly identified with the well-educated professional classes and less orient to the values and interests and outlook of the working class voters who once constituted their base. And it's striking that we see this reversal, especially now into the early 2000s and then to 2016 in the United States and Britain and France and Germany and elsewhere. And I think it has to do, this educational divide, the diploma divide, it has to do with the intensified emphasis on meritocracy. So we have a difficult project. On the one hand, we want to encourage people to work hard. We want to encourage young people to believe that they have some responsibility for their success in life. But we don't want to create a public culture and an economy that teaches people that they are self-made and self-sufficient, that teaches the successful that their success is their own doing. Because if I really believe that my success is my own doing, it becomes pretty difficult to identify with those less fortunate than myself. Being aware of the role of luck and contingency in life, reminding myself of my indebtedness, can prompt a certain humility. There, but for the accident of fortune or the grace of God or the mystery of fate, go I. That could be me. This attitude of humility is a civic virtue in short supply these days. But it's a civic virtue that I think we need. It could, since recognizing the role of luck and good fortune among the successful, it could prompt a certain humility, which could in turn open us to a greater sense of responsibility, of mutual responsibility for everyone in our society. It could open us to a greater appreciation too of the dignity of work, the dignity of the work performed by many whom we rely on who don't have advanced degrees or prestigious credentials. The pandemic, in a way, brought this lesson home more vividly than before. The pandemic revealed inequalities in our societies that existed before the pandemic, but it made them more vivid. One of the most obvious ways it did this was that during the lockdowns, there were those of us who could work from home and hold webinars and meetings on Zoom. But there were a great many of our fellow citizens who didn't have that luxury, who either lost their jobs or who, in order to perform their jobs, had to expose themselves to risk on behalf of the rest of us. I'm thinking not only of those working in the hospitals, but I'm thinking of delivery workers, warehouse workers, grocery store clerks, childcare workers, truck drivers. These are not the most highly paid or the most honored members of our societies. But during the pandemic, we began referring to them as essential workers, as key workers. So this could be a moment for a broader public debate about how to bring their pay and recognition into better alignment with the importance of the work they do. We often assume that the money people make is the measure of their contribution to the common good. But the pandemic, I think, has led us to question that assumption. Nobody I know was calling hedge fund managers essential workers during the pandemic. But nurse assistants, warehouse workers, and delivery workers, these were the essential workers. So I think what we need to do is to shift our focus in public discourse away from arming people for meritocratic competition to a greater emphasis on the dignity of work, on cultivating respect and honor and recognition for those who make invaluable contributions to the common good, even though the market is not the full measure of their merit, of their contribution. So these are the reflections, and they connect ultimately to questions about justice, to questions about who deserves what and why. Questions that we need, I think, to ask again, especially in the light of the pandemic, because I think it's the only way to lead us beyond the harsh ethic of success that drives us apart. Perhaps asking these questions and debating them publicly can lead us to a less rancorous, less divisive, more generous public life.
That was very, very succinct and very well presented. But let me, I see where you're going and I see where you're coming from. And obviously it's a very moralistic and a very important viewpoint, very humanitarian viewpoint, I would like to think. But on reading your book, I found something very interesting. You trace it back in religion. You say meritocracy began in the 20th century, but you trace it back to Calvin, pre-Calvinist, in fact, even the Roman Catholic days, and even all the way to Aquinas, I think, or even before that, that you said, that, look, Augustine, I think, sorry, that you said that Augustine also had the view that basically God's grace was bestowed on people who had merit. And in Islam also, we have something similar, that God will forgive us if we have goodness in us, right? Which our fundamentalists seem to have forgotten. But nevertheless, all religions enjoin the same thing. So would you how would you differ with the fact that maybe meritocracy or thinking of merit is so in our soul that we can't order society without merit?
Well, it's a fascinating question. And it does, this debate about merit does go back a long way. And it runs deep in our religious traditions, just as you've said. In fact, it goes back to the biblical story of Job, who was a good man, a virtuous man, and yet he was suffering unspeakably, and he couldn't understand why. Because he assumed, as everyone in the story assumed, that goodness leads God to reward you, and that evil doing leads God to punish you. And so it created a kind of cosmic meritocracy, this way of thinking, where whenever misfortune or suffering befell someone, the first question they asked was, what did I do wrong? And whenever somebody enjoyed success, the first people asked about him or her was, well, what was the virtuous act that prompted this reward? So the idea that God matches reward and punishment to goodness and to evil, this runs very deep in our religious traditions. And what it suggests, it's an empowering way of thinking in a way, because it suggests if I act righteously, if I display virtue, if I'm a good person, I will be rewarded. That's a great that's a great source of agency if one thinks about it. So here is Job suffering, but Job is a good man. And his friend, he loses his family even, and he's in mourning, and his friends come. And what do they say to him? Instead of consoling him, they say, well, think harder. What did you do wrong to bring this upon you? There's a cruelty in that. Now, this is the harsh side of meritocracy, of divine meritocracy. And finally, God appears from the whirlwind. And Job says, God, what have I done wrong to deserve this? And God sets him right. He said, Job, it doesn't work that way. Everything bad that happens is not a punishment, and everything good that happens is not a reward. God says, in effect, God reminds Job, it rains over the oceans where no crops are growing. Rain is not only a reward to the farmer who's virtuous. There is a mystery, God says, a mystery to creation. And human beings are not at the center. The universe is bigger. The moral universe is bigger than human beings. And this leads, so God, for the first time, says, it isn't all about us. We are not self-made and self-sufficient. Yes, we can shape our destiny to some degree, but it's a hubris to assume we are self-made and self-sufficient, that we've figured everything out. There's a perfect alignment between virtue and reward. And then, just as the Dean has said, this debate works its way through the religious faiths. And in Christianity, there's a debate about whether salvation is earned as a matter of merit, or whether it's entirely a matter of God's grace, a mystery. And so it's true that the impulse to meritocracy, to believing that our fate is in our hands, goes back a very long way. But it's equally true that there is a counterpart, a moral counterpart to merit, which is grace, humility in the face of mystery, recognizing that our fate exceeds our control. And this leads in various religious traditions to the idea that we should be humble. Those of us who succeed especially should be humble in the face of our success. We should not assume that it's all our doing. And therefore, we should take some responsibility for those who may be less materially successful. Now, this is a debate about whether salvation is earned or a matter of grace. In our day, of course, our debates about earning and deserving are not so much about salvation. They tend more to be about worldly, material success. But the structure of the debate is similar. Are the rich rich because they are more deserving than the poor? Or is there a complex combination of fortune, of indebtedness, of effort and striving, but also of circumstance that accounts for who succeeds economically and who doesn't? But noticing, as the Dean has emphasized, this long human struggle with the question of merit versus grace and humility, I think makes it all the more important that we need to step back from our own material success in the present day and recognize that we are not wholly self-made and self-sufficient. But it's certainly true that this debate goes back a very long way.
Professor Sandel, let me bring you to another thing that you raise quite strongly in your book, is this thing about credentialism, and this thing, and the thing that you keep emphasizing, hubris, and hubris associated with credentialism. But again, let me go back a long way, even to Buddhism, for example, where nirvana is achieved only when you are a good person. So you go through stages of life to achieve nirvana. But coming back to medieval times, dukedom or these titles that we had were also associated with some form of merit. The king rewarded you for being a good swordsman or for being a good administrator, whatever. You got a dukedom. In modern days, credentialism is extremely important, as you point out. Going to Harvard, for example, where you teach, is extremely important. Harvard degree is worth probably God knows how many millions of dollars. But the question is, we begin very early. My grandchildren, for example, I'm already teaching them credentialism. Each class that they pass, they get A's, B's, C's, and they are already being taught that the A's and B's and C's matter. Your report card matters. So it's deeply ingrained in our culture. How do you see that changing, or can it change?
I think we need to question our obsession with credentials. And it isn't easy for just the reason that you suggest, because it begins with our most fundamental role, which is as parents. And as good parents, of course, we want to provide our children with every possible advantage in life. And in a society that prizes credentials, meritocratic credentials, we want to begin early and spare no effort to confer on our children the advantages that we've enjoyed as a result of the credentials that we've acquired. Credentials are the coin of the realm in a market-driven meritocratic society. But the danger is this. The danger is that it's not easy to preserve the distinction when we teach our kids and encourage our kids and try to motivate our children. It's not easy to remember or to teach the difference between studying hard and reading books to get an A for the credential, and learning and coming to love learning for its own sake. As parents, as good parents, of course, we want to equip our children with the instrumental value of education, the A's, the grades, the test scores that will enable them to get ahead. But we find, I think all of us find, that there's a fine line between equipping and motivating our children to compete effectively for good grades and high test scores, and cultivating a love of learning for its own sake, reading books that may not be tested, but that may deepen their understanding and their love of reading. And here's what I worry about. My students at Harvard, they are very accomplished. They have been cultivated to score well, to get good grades, but they have become subject to such an intense, high pressure, anxiety producing pressure to achieve from the time they were young, that by the time they arrive in university, having survived and prevailed in this meritocratic gauntlet of achievement and credentials, they are habituated to asking, what's next? What's the next credential? What do I need to do to succeed in this course, to get a good grade on this exam? And instead of stepping back and taking a deep breath and asking the question, what path do I want to pursue? What are my intellectual passions? What career will be most fulfilling and will contribute to the common good? How can I equip myself to reflect on what gives life meaning, on what enables me to be an effective citizen? These are intrinsic goods that higher education ought to be about. And I worry that the credentializing function of higher education is beginning to crowd out the intrinsic love of learning and our pedagogical purpose, our educational mission. So the tyranny of merit, here's the paradox, the tyranny of merit bears down on those who were left behind in the unfairness that they've never really had a chance to compete. But it also bears down and inflicts a kind of injury on the winners, because at least in some circumstances, it subjects young people to intense pressures to achieve that sometimes lead to emotional and mental health difficulties, but in any case often leads to losing sight of the intrinsic goods of education and learning and personal development. Now, I don't know if you've noticed, have you noticed this among the classes of young people who are competing for university spots in Pakistan, or has this become this intense competitive pressure something that I'm noticing close at hand? Do you see that in Pakistan?
Oh, yes, of course. I've got people here who are taking 3 months off to prepare for the GRE, who are spending their life as if it depends on the GRE. So it's become extremely, extremely important to score well on these test scores. And yes, I think you point that out too, that life should not depend on an IQ test or a GRE or something like that.
Yeah.
But let me go a little bit further on this. When you talk about this hubris, now partly the hubris is kind of earned by your effort. So we have to distinguish it in 2 or 3 things. We have to distinguish in talent, like Djokovic has extreme talent of playing tennis. I can't possibly compete with him, right? So just does Djokovic deserve the money he gets? Should he have the hubris of being the 21-time Grand Slam player? Or should I feel jealous? Should I feel lessened by him? If I extend that analogy, does that not apply in every field almost? There are Djokovic, there are Nobel Prize winners. Like, for example, Angrist won the Nobel Prize. Should I be worried or should I not be worried? So, I mean, things like that. How do you react to that?
Fair enough. Fair enough. Yes, I do think it extends to these domains of earning and deserving. Now, Djokovic, he makes a lot of money playing tennis and winning tournaments. And it's partly due to his effort and training, which is very intense and disciplined. But you and I, as you've mentioned, could train even harder than Djokovic, 24 hours a day. And well, I'll speak for myself. I would never be as good a tennis player. You might be a good tennis player.
Not at all.
Which brings us, just as you say, to talent. Now, the effort and striving leads us to assume that our success is the result of our effort. But of course, effort has to be combined with talent in order to produce a great tennis player like Djokovic. And talent is not having great talent is not the doing of Djokovic. It's his gift, it's his fortune, it's his luck. He develops his talents. He's to be admired for that. And we do admire the talent independent of the effort that he expended, in a way. We admire it as an achievement, as an expression of human possibilities, just as we admire a great violin performance, let's say. Apart from our admiration for the long hours we know went into the practicing of the violinist. But there are 2 elements of contingency to talents. First, it's not Djokovic doing that he is gifted as an athlete, nor is it his doing that he lives at a time when tennis is very popular. If he had lived back in the days of the Renaissance, nobody cared about tennis back then. He could be just as talented, but nobody cared about tennis. They cared more about fresco painters. So that I have the talents that society happens to reward at this moment, that's not my doing, that's my good luck. So our admiration, I think, needs to be mixed with, leavened by a recognition of gifts, which are admirable, independent of effort. But I would say that in virtue of his athletic gifts or her athletic gifts, any great athlete owes something for his or her success. And that takes us back to a mutual obligation.
But Michael, let me bring you back to this. What you've written in your book, before I turn to the floor, I must ask you this. You've written in your book that the American dream is not as real as might seem. And there are other people too, for example, I think Frank has written about it, other people have written about it too, that luck is an important factor in success. And people have shown it through data and things like that. And I think Clark has shown that the nobility or whatever, money seems to carry through generations. There's not as much social mobility as we like. But if the American dream, which we are all trying to copy, please try and understand. I'm sure you understand that we in this part of the world, the lesser people, are trying to copy the American dream. We are trying to put everything that America did in place, the institution that America had, the competitive element that America had, the Ricardian distribution system of marginal product equaling wage. We are trying to do all that. We are trying to imitate the American inequality. And now suddenly you come along and you say, the American dream is not as intact as it was, and that the social democratic countries of the north of Northern Europe are probably, there's more social mobility possible there. And surprisingly, you even mentioned China, that China, there's more social mobility possible, and that China is dismantling certain systems to challenge meritocracy. Please explain that.
Well, in the United States, we've long lived with greater inequality than many European countries by consoling ourselves with the thought that we don't need to worry about inequality as those class-based European societies do because we have mobility. That's the American dream. No one is consigned to the fate of his or her birth. It's always possible to rise one generation to the next. So we don't need to worry about inequality. The result is we've been, I think, too complacent in accepting extreme inequalities of income and wealth. And the result is that our mobility rates, intergenerational mobility rates, are less, not greater, than most Western European countries. In Denmark, where mobility is highest, according to the OECD, the number of generations it takes for a low-income family to rise to the median income is 2 generations. That's in Denmark. In the United States, it takes 5 generations on average. And so what we're learning is that mobility, individual upward mobility, is not an adequate answer to inequality. And this is because a greater measure of equality, access to health and education, are a necessary condition for mobility. So inequality is not a spur to upward mobility. A certain measure of equality is necessary to enable people from all backgrounds to develop their capacities. So don't learn, Pakistan should not learn from the United States the wrong lessons. I hope Pakistan does not learn from the United States that it's possible to have a successful economy and society with a wider and wider gap between rich and poor. That's a mistake that we have made over the past 4 decades. The version of finance-driven globalization we have pursued has rewarded the top 10, 20% of the income scale, but has left the bottom 50 or 60% with stagnant wages. And this has led to division, to resentment, to the loss of solidarity and the loss of social cohesion. So I hope that Pakistan will learn the right things to emulate, but not to emulate our embrace, our complacence, I should say, of deep inequalities of income and wealth, telling ourselves, well, it's always possible for the individual to rise. That's the myth of the American dream that has not served us well and that has led to the loss of social cohesion and a sense of mutual responsibility. And it's fed the polarization that we now see. So take the best from us. Be a little bit skeptical about our willingness to accept very high levels of income and wealth inequality. Does that make sense?
That does make sense. But let me turn you in the direction of solutions.
Yeah.
So Professor Sandel, speak to the solution. How do we order society, especially now, in this era where we see the rise of fundamentalism, all sorts? I've just talked about Muslim fundamentalism, but you've got your versions of fundamentalism, which we saw in, I think, Texas the other day.
Yes.
And we see the rise of all kinds of extremists turning up in Europe, everywhere, Brexit, as you mentioned. But within that, let me also put another curve in there, which I think we should face. The rise of technology. Technology may, in fact, we are very fearful here. Technology might marginalize us. We are a labor-abundant economy. We send people like our caregivers and our workers to you to be able to do the menial jobs, and technology may take them away. In that scenario where technology could possibly marginalize our countries even further, we are already the worst performers, so we suffer from an inferiority complex, as you said, that, hey, the West is the hubris and we are the poor performers, so we also suffer. Now, in that milieu, how would you propose a solution both for the West and ourselves, and puts technology in there with this rising technology and possibility of so many scenarios that you probably know better than I do? How do we order our society now?
The first step, I think, is to put a greater focus than we have done on the dignity of work. The dignity of work that everyone performs, whether they have professional degrees or not. Martin Luther King Jr., just before he was assassinated, traveled to Memphis, Tennessee, and gave a talk to a group of striking sanitation workers, garbage collectors. And what he told them was, in the final analysis, the person who picks up your garbage is as significant as the physician. Because if he doesn't do his job well, disease will be rampant. And then he added, all labor has dignity. So we have to cultivate in the public culture, but also in the system of economic reward, an appreciation of the dignity of work. We have to reverse the steep hierarchy of prestige between jobs that do and don't require advanced professional degrees. And that means honoring not only paid labor, but also the work that doesn't show up in the labor market, including caregiving, much of it, which is not through the labor market. As for technology, we in recent decades have seen and have assumed it must always be so, that new technology will replace low-skilled and middle-skilled work, and will increase the value of high-skilled work. Hence the emphasis on credentialism. If you want to compete and win in the global economy, we are told, go to university, get an advanced degree. What you earn will depend on what you learn. We've heard this slogan reiterated for 4 decades. But this assumes that technology is an autonomous force beyond human or political control. It assumes that the direction of technology is like a force of nature. I think that's a mistake. Technology need not replace low and middle skilled jobs. If we direct it in a human direction, technology can augment and enhance low-skilled and medium-skilled jobs, make them more productive, allowing for greater wages to be paid to those who perform that kind of work. If you think historically, new technologies have not always been biased in the direction of high-skilled labor. The Industrial Revolution, which created the factory, the assembly line, created jobs and opportunities, not for the best educated, but also for workers who had less education. So we've just assumed that with the development of computing and with laptops and with microchips, that this all serves the needs and the economic benefit of high-skilled labor. I think we need deliberately to direct technology to augment rather than replace. In Silicon Valley, they had the idea they'll invent robots to replace workers, especially middle-skilled and low-skilled. But that need not be the agenda. I think that we collectively, democratically, have to debate this. What directions, what kinds of innovations do we want technology to serve? So I think this has to be central to the political agenda, to public debate, and therefore to development economics, to join the debate about how to direct technology to augment and enhance work rather than to replace it.
Very, very good.
Do you think that's too
so much? Sorry.
Do you think that's too optimistic, Nadeem?
Well, I don't know. I'm kind of divided on this, but let me confront you with another thing. I mean, I know it's too exciting to talk to you, so I can't give up, but I should, because there are people wanting to ask. But let me just quickly raise this question. I must put in the economists. You've been dueling with economists for a while, so I must get you to display your dueling with economists. The economists contend that we need inequality for innovation, and one of the reasons that the US is
that we need what?
We need inequality for innovation.
Oh, I see.
That we need to reward the innovator. In fact, you know, the people like Lucas and Romer, etc., have argued that we need monopolistic patents to be able to innovate further. So there's a whole theory of patenting, which I don't need to tell you about. But the question is that without creating inequalities, and Ronald Reagan has talked about it, you quoted in your book too, that without creating inequalities, without rewarding innovation, the American innovation machine would fall, and hence the American leadership in the world. And we also think that, so we are trying to actually put in all kinds of mechanisms where we reward. So we're trying to create inequality, as you said. But within this also is the thing that you write in your book, which is very fascinating, which is amazing, how the American presidential debate, or whatever American theology about, I should say political philosophy, has revolved around 2 concepts. One is deservedness and the other is the risingness. How do you rise in society and how do you deserve what you get? And what you pointed out is that Trump kind of put paid to it and developed a whole new narrative, even though he comes from a position of strength, of wealth. So there's a whole new paradox there. Can you talk to that a little, please?
All right. Well, you've asked, Nadeem, 2 really big questions. Let me start at least with the first, rewarding innovation. Do we need monopolies and long-term patents to promote innovation? And you're right, this is a debate among economists. And here's what I would say about it. First, yes, we should reward innovation. The question is how. And I think that we make a mistake to reward innovation through the use, at least in some domains, through the use of long-term patents that create monopolies for an extended period of time, especially in the area of pharmaceuticals. Think about the COVID vaccines now, which we still have not gotten in sufficient quantities to developing countries. One of the best ways of doing that would be to eliminate the patent, to lift the patents on the COVID vaccine, to allow pharmaceutical companies to produce billions more doses of the vaccine, and for that matter, the therapeutics, in developing countries. Now, of course, the pharmaceutical companies don't want this. They want the monopoly, and they use the argument that you attributed to some economists, that unless we have long-term patents giving us monopolies on pharmaceutical drugs, there will be no innovation. The fact of the matter is, the United States is lagging in innovation, partly as the result of our economy being subject to a kind of dominance by monopolies in many domains, less competition. So I think we should explore other ways, and some economists have proposed other ways of rewarding innovation than long-term monopoly patents, especially on drugs that are desperately needed by everyone in the world to combat a pandemic. And there are ways of providing rewards in terms of lump sum, large rewards, monetary rewards for developing innovations. Let's say, take the example of drug development. Why is it that we have a huge drug industry? Well, we've not, technology has not developed a cure for malaria or a vaccine, but technology has developed a cure, a drug to deal with erectile dysfunction. Now, is that because technology just happened to work that way? Or is that because the incentive structures for developing drugs for tropical diseases don't point technology and the pharmaceutical industry in that direction? So I think that we could have financial rewards, government subsidies for innovations of the kind that we need and want, that serve the public good, without, and as it is, these vaccines, especially the Moderna vaccine, were developed drawing on basic research with billions of dollars of government funding. And yet the pricing system and the distribution system does not reflect that. So rewarding innovation, yes, but let's find ways of rewarding innovation through large financial grants, if need be, that does not require locking in long-term monopoly patents, especially for drugs. And as far as the West spreading this idea of monopoly patents being a necessary condition for innovation, one of the big mistakes I think we made globally, and the United States was largely at fault for this, for driving this during the last 4 decades, was insisting on free trade agreements that so-called harmonized the patent protection for drugs, pharmaceuticals, and other needed goods. I think that's a mistake. I think we can find ways, more effective ways, to reward and motivate innovation that also directs innovation in line with public purposes than the system of monopoly patents that we currently have.
Great. Thank you very much. I think I'll have to give up my question in the interest of time. So let me turn to the floor. InnoVentures, please go ahead. introduce yourself and ask a question quick?
Yes, hi, Dr. Sandel. Fascinating conversation. I'm really enjoying it. A couple of really quick questions. So the way I think of meritocracy is where, obviously you pick people based on their ability to do a certain job. So when you are arguing against meritocracy, are you then also arguing that, for example, the Chinese Communist Party system of rigorous testing and examination and performance and evaluation, which has led to obviously, China behaving that way and keeping a very clean government and all that, are you then arguing that, that's not a good idea, that people should be promoted, progressed based on how they perform? And also, are you then also arguing that instead of rewarding people for their effort, which is a sort of a capitalistic idea, that you should reward people for their need? Should people doing dissimilar amounts of work, requiring dissimilar preparation, be rewarded the same amount or sort of similar amounts? So I think that's a couple of scenarios that if you could sort of explain your position a little bit on, I think that'd be very useful
Right.
for me.
And tell me your name.
Yeah, my name is Athar. Yeah, that's my company's name. My name is Athar Usama. I am a public policy professional.
Great, thank you. Thank you for that. First of all, in the example you gave, I think maybe Singapore would be a better example of a place that emphasizes the meritocratic and implements the meritocratic idea of picking people for government jobs according to merit. I'm not arguing against in companies or in government offices picking people who are well qualified. This goes back to what I was saying at the outset about the surgeon I want. I want a well-qualified surgeon. And so picking people according to their qualifications is fine. Now, we call that meritocracy if the alternative is nepotism and corruption and prejudice. And I'm not defending any of those things. The question is, how do we allocate the rewards in society? And what attitudes towards success and to deservingness do we want to encourage and promote? So to go back to Nadeem's example about how we teach and motivate our children, we do want to teach and motivate our children to study hard and to work hard and to take responsibility for their success in school. But we don't want our children, if they get A's and if they get admitted to a top university, we don't want them to embrace the hubristic idea that they succeeded because they're deserving and their neighbor or their classmate who struggles with math, let's say, or some subject, deserves a lesser fate in life. So the question and the challenge, I suppose, that you raise is, how can, if it's a good thing to choose people for jobs who are well qualified for the jobs, what should be the pattern of reward? Now, you asked about rewarding people based on need. If we're talking about access to food and shelter and decent health care, I would say we should allocate on the basis of need, not on the basis of a person's success in the labor market. So that's the argument for a strong social safety net based on need. Now, you then ask, well, but to motivate people to work hard, don't we have to offer them higher rewards? Well, yes, often we do, up to a point. But if that's the rationale for the reward, to elicit effort, we need to remember that that's what the reward signifies, rather than to add the thought that the reward is a matter of deservingness, that the rich are rich because they are more deserving than the poor. That's where meritocracy slides into hubris and leads to social division. I agree, it's a subtle distinction. It's a thin line between giving people inducements, motivations, including financial, to work hard, and sending the message that if they do work hard, that and they achieve financial success of some kind, they are more deserving than those who don't. That's the hard line to preserve, the difficult line to preserve.
Dr. Nadeem, please unmute yourself.
Farrukh Zaman. Quickly, short of time.
Thank you, PIDE, for arranging this session. And I'm blessed to have Michael Sandel on the other side. Sir, I have two quick questions. The first one is on individual level, how to convince someone to give up their wealth for greater good, of course. How to convince them? Why would someone should give up their wealth or a part of it? And the second question is how to convince states to change course in a human direction. How to convince states to change course when they know the solution is pushing this system to perfection. When they know, especially for developing state, when they know that the countries like US have benefited from this system. So how would we convince states, and what should be done in that matter?
Let's turn to Professor Sandel. Go ahead.
Well, thank you for the question, Professor Zaman. How to persuade people to give up their wealth? Even that way of framing the question presupposes an idea that I think we need to challenge and reflect upon. Go back to Djokovic, or to LeBron James, an athlete who makes even more than Djokovic. LeBron James makes something like $40 million a year. Now, he's a great basketball player. In what sense is it his wealth that we need to persuade him to give up? And in what, or is it the case that the wealth that the market bestows on those with great talents in high demand is the society, in some large measure, the society's wealth? Well, it depends on what you think about the argument that I was proposing before in response to Nadeem. If LeBron James is indebted for his athletic gifts, and to those who made it possible, and to the community that honors and rewards basketball, then his wealth is not entirely his wealth alone, but it's the wealth that results from the society and the community in which he lives. And so it's really questioning at a fundamental level, what counts as my wealth? It's true that the labor market provides a provisional definition of my wealth. If I'm a great basketball player or a hedge fund manager. But once we reflect on the conditions and the rules and the structures that make that wealth possible, we see that it's embedded in a wider society, and therefore the society has some claim on it. Now, so answering that question depends on unpacking what we mean exactly by persuading people to give up their wealth. De facto, they have it because that's what the labor market has dispensed, or maybe inheritance has dispensed. But the question is, what should be the rules and what should be the attitudes by which we define who deserves what and why?
Thank you. Samia Altaf. Samia.
Sorry, I needed to unmute myself. Thank you very much. It's an honor to have Professor Sandel on my laptop. Professor Sandel, I quite agree with you. You've spoken about, the appropriate application of technology and, credentialing and, innovation and of course, love of learning. But, as I see, I worked in the United States as well as in Pakistan with students on both sides and with people in the government and private sector. What I see is that the individual makes decisions based on the role models that they have in their particular professional field. There's a hierarchy of let's say, skills that are awarded accordingly. There's a hierarchy of competencies. So at an individual level, that's what the individual looks at, and they decide that this is how their incentives are aligned, and they move towards that. They say, yes, they have love of learning, but they want to give that up and they want to, pursue this particular skill because that's what gets reward in the marketplace. I am struggling with this fact that these are the decisions that the individual makes at an individual personal level. And yet we want to reform society at a societal level. And in a country like Pakistan, where people in power who are in decision-making positions, they don't think that they are making poor decisions. They don't think that there is hubris involved here. They actually think that they are doing a very good job and making very good decisions which are in the interest of the people. And they should continue doing that. So how do we resolve that? Because, we see that in Pakistan all the time in front of us in every domain and in every field. Just the recent example of 22 people dying in Murray when they had gone to see the snowfall. And of course, if you look at the defense of the policymakers, they don't think that they did anything wrong.
Yeah.
So.
Well, thank you, Professor Altaf. I wonder if I could ask you, you mentioned role models, and I think that's important in cultivating attitudes or changing attitudes. And who are the role models in our societies? I mean, you mentioned those in government and politics. There are those we've spoken about celebrities, celebrity athletes, and then there are teachers, there are policymakers, there are scientists, there are musicians. I think changing attitudes, which is really what we're discussing, requires that leaders in various domains of society have to take this on as a shared project. But I'd like to ask if I could ask you a kind of follow-up question to help me understand this, Professor Altaf. Earlier on with Nadeem, we were talking about the extent to which the American model serves as an example for Pakistan and developing countries. And I was worrying that that Pakistan not emulate some of our unfortunate tendencies, especially to do with inequality. To what extent do you think, and you mentioned that you had traveled and taught in both places, do you think that the United States on the whole is a positive or negative role model for Pakistan and for the developing world with regard to these matters?
Samia?
Yes. Professor Sandel, I am a public health physician and I have worked in the public health field in both areas.
I see.
My personal opinion is that the model of healthcare organization and delivery of services is really not a good model for Pakistan to follow, because Pakistan's problems are entirely different. The challenges and constraints are entirely different. However, that is the model that is the gold star and the ideal. and the positions of power and authority and money are all attached to that, which is why we find that 50% of the graduating medical graduating class of Pakistan kind of kills itself to get to United States. I was one of those physicians who 35 years ago left to go work in United States. And of course, at an individual level, the rewards are great. But I'm finding it very difficult. I've been writing about this for the past 15 years, but I'm finding it very difficult to speak to my professional colleagues, even people who are at my age, have all of us have retired, and the young medical students and policymakers or people in the government who try to convince them that for Pakistan, US model of healthcare is really not an appropriate model. It's not a question of good or bad. It's just not appropriate. But there are no takers for that because that is the gold star.
Yeah. Well, I see the force of what you say, and I'm sure you're right about that. That leads me to think that we need to change our system of healthcare, not only for the sake of providing a better example, but also for the sake of making our society better, because our system of healthcare works well for those who have a good health insurance policy through work, but it works very badly for those who are left out and those who don't have access. And we do not control costs in an effective way. So I think we've been talking throughout this session about humility as an individual trait. And what our conversation makes me think is that America needs a greater dose of humility, especially as it projects its version of capitalism, and in this case, of a not very good healthcare system to the rest of the world. And I think it would do us good, as well as perhaps providing a better example. This may not be a short-term solution because this is a long-term project. But we've been struggling with our healthcare system and debating it for some time. And so here's yet another reason why I think we need to do better.
Thank you. Very good. Well, Professor Sandel and
we have time for one more, maybe.
Okay, great. Thank you. Sarah Said, then I'll just have two more questions. That's it. Sarah Said.
Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Nadeem. I'm Sarah Said from the Ministry of Finance. You talked about deservingness and the income gaps that we have. When we talk about dignity of work, naturally it will translate into what incentives are being given to people at different levels. And I think it was Robert Reich who said in his book, Saving Capitalism, that we earn only a fifth of what we receive as income. So in the past decade, we've seen different movements, like in the US, the Occupy Wall Street movement. With the death of trade unionism already in the United States and with the failure of Occupy Wall Street. And also I wanted to point out that in Pakistan, we had no such, movement here on the popular front. What's the next? What's the future?
Well, the future is open and up for grabs, but ill-defined, I would say. One thing, we've just lived through a tumultuous 4-year period in the United States with the presidency of Donald Trump as he left, the attack on the US Capitol, all now in the midst of struggling with a pandemic that we still have not brought under control. One effect of these tumultuous events and of the backlash that produced the election of Donald Trump is that the economic certitudes of the past 4 decades, I think, have been called into question. For roughly 4 decades, since the 1980s, we were in the grip of a certain market faith. And this was true across the political spectrum. Center left and center right parties embraced the market faith that came in with the Reagan and Thatcher years, but its fundamental principle was accepted even by the center left party, the Democratic Party in the United States, that replaced it during the Clinton and Obama years. The idea that market mechanisms are the primary instrument for defining and achieving the public good. And this led us to embrace and to insist upon, they called it the Washington Consensus, you'll remember, a certain neoliberal version of global capitalism that, if anything, was reinforced by the end of the Cold War. Because when the Berlin Wall fell, we told ourselves, liberal capitalism has prevailed. There is no other system. And this led to a kind of complacence and hubris. And so we pressed on the rest of the world a version of finance-driven capitalism that did not serve the developing world well, and also did not serve us well. And it generated, now I'm speaking about its effects within the United States, it generated anger and resentment and legitimate grievances among those who had been left behind, those who faced job loss and stagnant wages, and the insult of elites looking down. And this led to the backlash against mainstream politics that we saw in 2016 with the election of Donald Trump. And then came the pandemic, which unleashed massive government spending of a kind that couldn't be contemplated previously, even after the financial crisis of 2008. And all of this, I think, has led us to question the market triumphalist faith, at least to some degree, and to question the finance-driven version of global capitalism that we were so confident we could spread around the world. So I think that what we're seeing now, and this is not a prediction of the future, but what we're seeing now is a greater openness to questioning the market faith, the neoliberal market faith that guided American policymakers for 4 decades. And what the result will be is very difficult to say, because in some ways the pandemic reinforced inequalities rather than eroded them. But I think the public mind is changing. I think, and we need leadership, we need political imagination, but I think there is space now for a broader public debate about what should be the role of markets in a good society, what should be the role of finance. What should be, how can we find our way to a political economy that aims at the common good rather than simply assumes that the money people make in the market is the measure of their contribution to the common good? The pandemic has called that assumption into question. So this is not to predict the future, but it is to suggest that there is now an opening as the doctrinaire commitment to the market faith of the neoliberal years, I think, has been called into question. I don't know whether you sense this in Pakistan, and maybe some among my American colleagues would say this is wishful thinking, but I think at least there is space now for a broader public debate about how to create an economy that is more hospitable to democracy, to democratic public discourse, and to a reconfiguration of the economy including in healthcare, which we discussed a moment ago, that is more directed to the common good.
Mhm. Great, thank you. Last question, Mahbub Mahmood.
Dr. Sandel, it's a pleasure to meet you. My name is Mahbub Mahmood. I have an edtech company, and I want to ask you that although you might have a less catchy title, would it be fairer to have a title something like The Tyrannical Possibility of Merit? Albert Hirschman, in his lovely little book, The Passion and the Interest, recounts how over 400 years we developed a concept of hard work, diligent, merit-based focus, and the diligent pursuit of wealth. And the idea was that this was the least dangerous passion, the passion for greed. If we go back to the common good, you know, we've had a terrible history in being seduced or bullied by people who want to define the common good. So is this really a question of trying to overthrow the tyranny of merit or trying to rein in the tyrannical possibilities of merit?
Well, thank you for that very nuanced question and suggestion. I will accept the new title you propose. What I really want to do is to rein in the tyrannical possibilities of merit, but I want to add that those possibilities have become reality, and certainly in my society, to such a degree that they have prompted polarization, division, backlash, and a danger to democracy. So while I do want to rein in the tyrannical possibilities of meritocracy, I think those possibilities, those tyrannical possibilities, have already produced a backlash that is threatening democracy. But as for Albert Hirschman's suggestion, and going back to Hume and other thinkers, about the diligent pursuit of wealth being a safer, more secure basis for human motivation than the pursuit of the common good, I would not agree. I would not agree with that. You are right that history is littered with examples of the pursuit of the common good, of people who were seduced or bullied by the pursuit of the common good in ways that led to tyrannies of their own. That's true. But I think today we look around and can see that the pursuit of wealth is not exempt from the seductive and bullying consequences that you rightly associate with the pursuit of the common good. I think today we need to rein in the unbridled pursuit of wealth and greed and self-interest. And for that, we need moral and civic resources, which taken together can be described as the pursuit of the common good, mindful of the fact that you rightly emphasize that governing according to some conception of the public good or the common good can go desperately wrong, especially when the meaning of the good is given in a fixed, non-negotiable way by fundamentalist or intolerant voices. The question is, what is the best way of protecting our societies, of immunizing our societies, of making them less vulnerable to fundamentalist, intolerant conceptions of the common good? That's a serious question. I think it's a mistake to say we prevent fundamentalism and intolerance if we avoid a politics of the common good and rely instead on markets and on the pursuit of money and wealth. Because what happens then, and we've seen it in many of our societies, is there is created a vacuum of meaning, a vacuum of moral and civic purpose that will be filled by narrow, intolerant fundamentalist voices. So I think, well, I take your general point. I think a society cannot sustain itself, especially one that aspires to be a pluralist democratic society, cannot sustain itself by forsaking or forswearing any attempt to articulate competing public notions of the good life, of the good society, of the common good. Citizens want, and rightly want, public life, politics, to be about big questions, questions that involve values, that involve questions about what makes for a just society. What do we owe one another as fellow citizens? What civic virtues should we inculcate? What do we owe one another as fellow citizens? And when our public life ceases to be about these big ethical questions, when we ask citizens to leave their moral and spiritual convictions outside when they enter the public square, we are not creating a public square that is safe and secure from fundamentalism and intolerance. We are creating a space, a moral void, an empty space that sooner or later will be filled with narrow, intolerant, fundamentalist voices. That's my worry. That's my argument against our becoming, our drifting from using market economies to becoming market societies. And here's where I disagree, as you can see, with the idea that the pursuit of wealth and self-interest alone is enough to sustain a pluralist way of life. This is why I think we need a pluralist politics of the common good.
But thank you very much, Professor Sandel. But before I let you go, just a very brief answer to this question. All that you said, then it seems to me, requires that democracy be redesigned. There's some talk by people saying that we've made the constitution of all the various countries, including the US, sacrosanct, unable to reform it. But also there's a certain paucity of thought on the reform of democracy. Is that something we can expect from you in the next book?
Well, I will try. I agree that constitutions need to be reformed. Certainly, the American Constitution is in desperate need of reform because we've reached a kind of moment of polarization that is leading a great many citizens to wonder whether democracy can survive under conditions of such polarization and divisiveness and rancor and resentment. So I think we need to work on two big projects at once. One, which we've discussed today, is a project of political economy, broadly conceived, to create an economy that is hospitable to self-government and to pluralism and to the cultivation of democratic values and a sense of empowerment for all citizens. And we need to reform constitutions and political institutions to make them more genuinely representative and to provide spaces for the kind of public discourse that democracy requires. We often assume that democracy is just about voting on election day. That's the last act of a democratic citizen. What democracy really requires to flourish is a healthy civil society, political institutions, and public spaces that bring people together from different walks of life, from different class backgrounds and religious backgrounds and ethnic backgrounds, to encounter one another in public. This is how we learn to negotiate and to abide our differences. This is how we come to share a sense of a common life. And this is how we come to care for the common good. So we have an economic project, we have a political and constitutional project. And I hope our conversation and discussion about how to forge this renovation of democracy, Nadeem, will continue.
Thank you very much, Professor Michael Sandel. I tell you, everybody in Pakistan is looking towards this, and we thank you from the bottom of our heart. You show exactly, display exactly what you argue for, the humility and the freedom from hubris. You being one of the most meritocratic professors in the world are willing to talk to us. We thank you from the bottom of our heart, and we are absolutely touched by your kindness. Please stay engaged, Professor Michael Sandel. Please keep us enriched with your ideas. Thank you very much. All the best.
Thank you very much. Thank you.